Winter came early to Salem in 1848. By mid-November, the town lay buried beneath a silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, transforming the narrow streets into corridors of white isolation. The houses, those dark, timber-framed structures with their steep roofs and small windows, looked like sentinels guarding secrets too terrible to speak aloud. This was not the Salem of witchcraft hysteria. Those days had passed more than a century and a half before, leaving behind only whispers and graves. But make no mistake, the darkness never truly left this place. It simply changed forms, burrowed deeper, found new shadows in which to hide. At the edge of town, where Crooked Lane curved away from the modest commerce of the harbor district and dissolved into frozen farmland, there stood a house that seemed to lean away from the world. 3 stories of weathered clapboard and black shutters. A chimney that rarely smoked, windows that caught the light in such a way that you could never quite see inside, even in broad daylight. This was the Whittaker house, and this is where our story begins. To understand what happened in that house, you must first understand the world that surrounded it. America in 1848 was a nation fracturing along invisible lines. The Mexican-American War had just ended, adding vast territories to a country already struggling with its own identity. Telegraph lines were beginning to connect distant cities, but most of America remained profoundly isolated. Small towns where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency, and where reputation meant survival. Salem itself had evolved from its Puritan roots into a prosperous maritime center. Ships arrived daily from China, India, the Caribbean, bringing silk, spices, and stories from worlds most Salem residents would never see. Wealthy merchant families built grand homes along Federal Street. The Custom House employed dozens. The East India Marine Society displayed exotic artifacts that drew visitors from Boston and beyond. But wealth creates shadows of its own. For every grand mansion on Federal Street, there were a dozen modest homes like the Whittakers. For every family ascending into prosperity, there were others descending into something else entirely. The town's population had peaked and begun its slow decline. The great fires of the previous decades had scarred entire neighborhoods, and beneath the veneer of respectability, Salem harbored the same darkness that lurks in any place where humans live in close proximity. Jealousy, greed, lust, violence. All carefully hidden, of course. In 1848, propriety was everything. Appearance was reality. What happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. Unless, of course, something went terribly wrong. Augustus Whittaker was 53 years old in the winter of 1848, though he looked older. Years of work as a shipwright had bent his spine and gnarled his hands, but his eyes remained sharp. Too sharp, some said. Gray eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. He was a widower. His wife Constance had died in childbirth 14 years earlier, delivering a son who lived only 3 days. The tragedy had transformed Augustus from a sociable, if reserved, tradesman into something else. A recluse who left his house only to work, who spoke to neighbors in monosyllables, who seemed to age a year for every month that passed. But he wasn't alone in that house. He had his daughters. Abigail Whittaker, the elder, was 26 years old that winter. Tall, unusually tall for a woman of that era, nearly 5 feet 9 inches, with dark auburn hair that she wore in a severe bun. Her features were sharp, angular, almost masculine in their strength. High cheekbones, a narrow nose, lips that seemed perpetually pressed into a thin line of disapproval or perhaps suppressed emotion. She dressed exclusively in dark colors, deep greens, browns, blacks. Never the lighter pastels that unmarried women her age typically favored. Her clothes were always modest, high-necked, long-sleeved, as if she were trying to disappear into the fabric itself. Those who encountered Abigail in town, at the general store, at church on the rare occasions the family attended, reported the same thing. She never quite met your eyes. Her gaze would slide away, focusing on something just past your shoulder. And when she spoke, which was seldom, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard even in the open street. Eleanor Whittaker, the younger sister, was 23. Where Abigail was severe, Eleanor was soft. Shorter, rounder, with the same auburn hair but worn loose around her shoulders, scandalous for an unmarried woman her age. Her face was fuller, prettier in a conventional sense, with large hazel eyes that seemed perpetually startled or afraid. Eleanor rarely left the house at all. When she did appear in public, she clung to Abigail's arm like a frightened child, though she was a grown woman. She wore lighter colors than her sister, pale blues, faded yellows, but the clothes hung on her strangely, as if they'd been made for someone else, or as if she'd lost significant weight. Neighbors noticed other things about Eleanor, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the bruises on her wrists that she tried to hide beneath her sleeves, the fact that she seemed to be aging backward, becoming more childlike, more dependent, less present in her own life. The three of them, Augustus and his two daughters, lived in that house on Crooked Lane like ghosts, haunting their own existence. They took no visitors. They hosted no gatherings. They participated in no community events. When townspeople encountered them, the Whittakers responded with such cold formality that eventually people stopped trying. And slowly, year by year, the whispers began. It started, as these things always do, with small observations that accumulated into suspicion. Mrs. Temperance Good, who lived 3 houses down from the Whittakers, mentioned to her sister-in-law that she'd never seen the Whittaker sisters together with any young men. Not once. Not at church socials. Not at town gatherings. Not walking along the harbor as courting couples did. "They're not ugly girls," Mrs. Good said, her voice pitched low over her sewing. "Well, Eleanor isn't at least. So why aren't they married? Why aren't they even courting?" Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Prudence Marsh, had her own observations to add. She'd seen Augustus walking to work early one morning, this was in the summer of 1847, and noticed something odd about his gait. He was limping, favoring his left leg, and when he'd adjusted his coat, Mrs. Marsh could have sworn she saw scratches on his neck. Long, deep scratches, like those made by fingernails. "Maybe he fell," Mrs. Good suggested. "Maybe," Mrs. Marsh replied, but her tone suggested she thought otherwise. Then there was Samuel Pritchard, the grocer, who supplied the Whittakers with their weekly provisions. He noted that their orders were strange. Too much food for 3 people, but delivered at odd hours, always after dark, and always collected by Abigail alone, who would load the heavy crates onto their cart without assistance, her face expressionless, before disappearing back up Crooked Lane. "There's something not right about that family," Pritchard told anyone who would listen. "The way she looks at you, or doesn't look at you, like she's seeing something else, something behind you." But the most disturbing observations came from Dr. Josiah Werner, one of Salem's 3 physicians. In the fall of 1847, Augustus Whittaker had summoned him to the house, a rare occurrence. When Dr. Werner arrived, he found Eleanor in bed, pale and feverish, barely conscious. "What's wrong with her?" Augustus had demanded, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's bedroom, blocking the doctor's full entry. Dr. Werner examined the young woman as best he could under Augustus's watchful gaze. Eleanor's fever broke within hours, likely just influenza. But what disturbed Dr. Werner wasn't the illness. It was the room itself. There was only one bed, a large bed, and on the other side of it a second pillow showed clear signs of recent use. Women's hairpins were scattered across both nightstands. 2 sets of slippers sat beside the bed. The sisters were sharing a bed, not unusual in and of itself. Many siblings shared sleeping quarters to conserve heat and space. But something about the scene troubled Dr. Werner. The way the room smelled, heavy, close, intimate. The way Abigail hovered nearby, watching Eleanor with an intensity that seemed to go beyond sisterly concern. The way Augustus positioned himself between the doctor and his daughters, as if guarding them, or guarding something else. Dr. Werner mentioned his unease to his wife, who mentioned it to her closest friend, who mentioned it to the Reverend's wife. And so the whispers spread like ink in water, diffusing, expanding, impossible to contain. By the winter of 1848, nearly everyone in Salem had heard some version of the rumors about the Whittakers, that the sisters were unnaturally close, that they never left each other's side, that they were seen through their window late at night, holding hands, faces too close together, that something dark and corrupt was happening in that house. But rumors are just rumors. Whispers are just whispers, until they're not. On the night of December 3rd, 1848, something happened that transformed whispers into accusations. The snow was falling heavily that evening, muffling all sound. Most of Salem had retired early, shuttering their windows against the cold. The streets were empty. The harbor was frozen. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At approximately 10 o'clock, Mrs. Temperance Good was woken by a sound. At first, she thought it was an animal, a fox or coyote crying in the darkness. But as she lay there, heart pounding, she realized the sound was human. A woman's voice, screaming. Not words, just raw, primal screaming that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night itself. The sound was coming from the direction of the Whittaker house. Mrs. Good woke her husband, who lit a lantern and peered out their window. He could see nothing through the heavy snow, but the screaming continued, rising and falling, desperate and terrible. By the time Mr. Good had dressed and stepped outside, the screaming had stopped. Lights appeared in other houses up and down Crooked Lane. Neighbors emerged, frightened, confused. "Did you hear that? What was it? Who was screaming?" All eyes turned toward the Whittaker house. It sat in darkness, no light in any window, as silent as a tomb. Several men, including Mr. Good and Samuel Pritchard, approached the house cautiously. They knocked on the door, tentatively at first, then more forcefully. No answer. They called out. Nothing. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of knocking and calling, the door opened a crack. Augustus Whittaker stood in the narrow opening, still fully dressed despite the late hour. His face was impossible to read in the shadows. "What do you want?" His voice was flat, hostile. "We heard screaming," Mr. Good said. "Is everything all right? Are your daughters—" "Everything is fine. Go home." "But we heard—" "You heard nothing. My daughters are asleep. I suggest you do the same." And with that, Augustus shut the door. They heard the bolt slide home with a heavy finality. The men stood in the falling snow, looking at each other with expressions of confusion and growing unease. Should they force entry? Call the constable? But on what grounds? They'd heard screaming, but now there was only silence. And Augustus had said everything was fine. In 1848, Salem, a man's home, was his castle. What happened behind those walls was his business. The men dispersed slowly, reluctantly, back to their own homes, but none of them slept well that night. And when morning came, when the snow finally stopped and weak winter sunlight illuminated Crooked Lane, neighbors noticed something they hadn't seen in the darkness. In the snow outside the Whittaker house, barely visible beneath the fresh accumulation, there were marks, drag marks, as if something or someone had been pulled from the front door across the yard toward the back of the property, and in the white expanse of new snow there were stains, small, dark, quickly covered by the continuing snowfall, but unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Blood. The question wasn't what had happened in the Whittaker house that night. The question was, what had been happening all along, and why had no one stopped it? Constable William Thatcher had been keeping the peace in Salem for 17 years. He dealt with drunken sailors, petty thieves, domestic disputes, and the occasional violent brawl at the taverns near the waterfront. He considered himself a practical man, not easily rattled, not given to flights of imagination. But standing outside the Whittaker house on that cold December morning, watching the weak sunlight illuminate those dark stains in the snow, He felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Not of physical danger. He'd faced that plenty of times. This was different. This was the fear of discovering something that couldn't be undone, couldn't be forgotten. The kind of truth that changes everything. He knocked on the door, once, twice, 3 times, no answer. "Mr. Whittaker, this is Constable Thatcher. I need to speak with you. It's a matter of public concern." The door opened slowly. Augustus Whittaker stood in the dim entryway, wearing the same clothes he'd had on the night before. His gray eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red. His face was haggard, drawn, as if he hadn't slept in days. "What do you want?" The same hostile tone. The same flat affect. "I need to come inside, Mr. Whittaker. There are concerns about what happened here last night." Nothing happened. "Sir, multiple witnesses heard screaming. There are marks in the snow. Stains." Thatcher kept his voice steady, professional. "I need to verify that your daughters are safe and well." For a long moment, Augustus said nothing. He simply stared at the constable with those penetrating gray eyes. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. No more. The smell hit Constable Thatcher first. It wasn't the smell of decay or death. He would have recognized that immediately. This was something else, something he couldn't quite identify, sweet and acrid at the same time, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and something else. Something organic and wrong. The interior was dark despite the morning hour. Heavy curtains covered every window. A single oil lamp burned in the parlor, casting long, distorted shadows across walls that seemed to lean inward, making the space feel smaller than it was. The furniture was sparse but well-maintained. A threadbare sofa, 2 wooden chairs, a small table covered with what appeared to be sewing materials, fabric, needles, thread, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had actually used these rooms in months. "Where are your daughters, Mr. Whittaker?" "Upstairs, resting." "I need to see them, to confirm they're unharmed." Augustus's jaw tightened. "They're sleeping. Then we'll wake them." For a moment, Thatcher thought the older man might refuse, might physically block him from ascending those narrow stairs that led to the 2nd floor. But then Augustus's shoulders slumped, just slightly, and he gestured toward the staircase. "Follow me." The stairs creaked under their weight, old wood protesting, warning, announcing their arrival. The smell grew stronger as they climbed. That same sweet rotten odor, mixed now with something that reminded Thatcher of unwashed bodies and chamber pots left too long unemptied. The 2nd floor hallway was even darker than the parlor below. 3 doors, all closed. Augustus stopped in front of the middle door. "They share a room," he said, his voice oddly defensive. "For warmth. The house is old, hard to heat." He knocked softly. "Abigail, Eleanor, the constable needs to see you." Silence. He knocked again. "Girls, open the door." Finally, a voice from within. Abigail's voice, low and flat. "A moment, please." They waited. Thatcher heard movement behind the door, whispered voices, footsteps, the rustle of fabric. It took nearly 3 minutes before the door finally opened. Abigail stood in the doorway, blocking entry. She wore a high-necked nightgown, her dark auburn hair hanging loose around her shoulders. In the dim light, Thatcher could see her face clearly for the first time, and what he saw disturbed him. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, dark circles beneath her eyes. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. But more than that, there was something in her expression, a strange mixture of defiance and resignation, as if she'd been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "I'm here," she said. "Eleanor is here. We're both fine. You can go now. I need to see your sister." "Is she sleeping?" "Miss Whittaker, I need to see both of you. I need to verify that neither of you is injured or in distress." Abigail's eyes, the same gray as her father's, locked onto Thatcher's face. And in that moment, the constable saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was pleading. A silent, desperate plea that seemed to say, "Don't look, don't see, turn away while you still can." But it was too late for that. Thatcher pushed past her gently but firmly, entering the room. What Constable Thatcher saw in that bedroom would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was larger than he'd expected, running nearly the full width of the house. But it felt suffocating, claustrophobic. The windows were covered not just with curtains but with heavy blankets nailed directly into the wall frames, blocking every trace of natural light. More oil lamps burned here, 4 of them, creating a warm, flickering illumination that made everything seem to move and shift. There was one bed, a large, ornate 4-poster bed with dark wooden posts carved with strange intertwining patterns, vines and flowers and something else, something that might have been human figures if you looked too closely. And in that bed, partially covered by blankets, was Eleanor Whittaker. She was awake, sitting up, staring at him with those large hazel eyes that Dr. Werner had mentioned. But there was something wrong with her gaze, something vacant, absent, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. "Eleanor?" Thatcher said softly. "Are you all right? Were you hurt last night?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd spoken. "Eleanor, I need you to answer me. Can you do that?" Still nothing. Thatcher took a step closer, and that's when he noticed more details. Eleanor's wrists, visible above the blankets, were bruised, dark purple marks in the distinct shape of fingers, as if someone had gripped her tightly, very tightly. Her neck bore similar marks, and on her left cheek, barely visible in the lamplight, was a fading bruise that looked several days old. "Who did this to you?" Thatcher asked, his voice harder now. He turned to Augustus, who stood in the doorway with Abigail. "Which one of you did this?" "She falls," Augustus said quickly. "She's clumsy, always has been. She bruises easily. Those are finger marks. She has nightmares. She thrashes in her sleep. Abigail has to restrain her sometimes to keep her from hurting herself." Thatcher looked at Abigail. "Is that true?" The tall woman met his gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes. Eleanor has, episodes. Night terrors. She doesn't remember them in the morning. And last night, the screaming. A nightmare. A bad one. She woke the whole household. But she's fine now. She's always fine in the morning." Thatcher turned back to Eleanor. The young woman hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't given any indication that she was even aware of the conversation happening around her. "Eleanor, I need you to tell me in your own words. Are you safe here? Has anyone hurt you?" For the first time, Eleanor's eyes focused. She looked directly at the constable, and for just a moment, he saw clarity there. Awareness. And something else. Something that might have been terror or might have been warning. Then her lips moved. She spoke in a whisper so soft Thatcher had to lean closer to hear. "We're a family," she said. "We take care of each other. We love each other. But are you safe?" "We love each other," Eleanor repeated, her voice taking on a strange, rehearsed quality. "Father takes care of us. Abigail takes care of us. We're a family." It was like listening to a child recite a lesson she'd been forced to memorize. There was no emotion in the words, no conviction, just empty repetition. Thatcher straightened, feeling bile rise in his throat. Something was profoundly wrong here. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him that these women were in danger, that something terrible was happening in this house. But what? He saw no weapons, no immediate threat. And both women insisted they were fine. In 1848, a man's authority over his household was nearly absolute. Without clear evidence of a crime, without a witness willing to testify, There was little Thatcher could do. "Mr. Whittaker," he said finally, turning to face Augustus, "I'll be checking on your daughters regularly. If I hear any more disturbances from this house, any more screaming, any more reports of concern, I'll be back. And next time, I'll bring witnesses. Do you understand?" Augustus nodded. "Perfectly. Miss Abigail, Miss Eleanor, if either of you needs help, my office is on Essex Street. You can come to me at any time." Abigail nodded but said nothing. Eleanor had already retreated back into that vacant, distant state, her eyes unfocused, staring at something only she could see. As Thatcher left the house and stepped back into the cold December morning, he realized his hands were shaking. Over the next week, Constable Thatcher did something he'd never done before in his career. He began investigating a family without any formal complaint or evidence of a crime. He talked to the neighbors again, gathering every scrap of information about the Whittakers. He spoke with Dr. Werner at length about his visit to the house. He even traveled to the custom house to review Augustus Whittaker's employment records, looking for any indication of the man's character or history. What he found painted a disturbing picture. Augustus had once been normal, social, even friendly. But after Constance's death in childbirth 14 years ago, something had broken inside him. He'd withdrawn from the community, stopped attending church, stopped accepting invitations or visitors. And his relationship with his daughters had changed. Mrs. Good remembered seeing Augustus walking with Abigail one summer evening about 8 years ago, when the girl would have been 18. They hadn't been walking like father and daughter. They'd been walking arm in arm, intimately close, his head bent toward hers as he whispered something that made her blush. Samuel Pritchard recalled a strange conversation he'd had with Abigail about 3 years ago when she came to collect groceries. He'd asked, innocently enough, if she had any suitors. Most young women her age would have blushed or deflected or shared news of courtship. Abigail had looked at him with those flat grey eyes and said, "I have everything I need at home." The way she said it, the emphasis on that last word, had made Pritchard uncomfortable enough that he never asked again. And then there was the testimony of Rebecca Crane, a seamstress who had visited the Whittaker house 5 years ago to deliver some mended clothing. She'd been invited inside, a rare occurrence, and had seen something that stuck with her. "The way they looked at each other," Rebecca told Thatcher, her voice low and troubled. "The father and the daughters. It wasn't natural. Augustus kept touching them. Just small touches. A hand on the shoulder, fingers brushing hair from a face. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl." "And the sisters?" Thatcher asked. "How did they interact?" Rebecca hesitated. "They were attached, literally." Eleanor was sitting on Abigail's lap. And mind you, Eleanor was 18 years old at the time, far too old for that sort of thing. And Abigail was stroking her hair, murmuring to her, "It reminded me of—" She paused, searching for words. "It reminded me of lovers, not sisters." On December 10th, a week after his first visit to the Whittaker house, Constable Thatcher received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was Sarah Bartlett, a young woman who worked as a domestic servant for several families in Salem. She was nervous, twisting her hands together, looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about the Whittakers. But you have to promise you won't say where you got this information. I can't promise that without knowing what you have to tell me. Then I can't help you." She turned to leave. "Wait." Thatcher stood quickly. "All right. I'll protect your identity as much as I'm able. What do you know?" Sarah reached into her basket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "I cleaned for Mrs. Good, 3 doors down from the Whittakers. Last week, after that screaming incident, I found this in Mrs. Good's garden. It was partially buried in the snow, like someone had thrown it from a window." She handed the book to Thatcher. "It's a diary. Eleanor Whittaker's diary. I recognized her name on the inside cover." Thatcher opened the book carefully. The pages were filled with careful, feminine handwriting, the script of an educated young woman. He flipped to a random page, dated March 1847, and began to read. What he read there made his stomach turn. Father came to our room again tonight. Abigail tells me I must accept it, that this is how families show love. But it doesn't feel like love. It feels like drowning. Abigail holds my hand through it all, whispers that we're together, that we'll always be together. Sometimes I think she's protecting me. Sometimes I think she's helping him. I don't know anymore. I don't know anything anymore. Thatcher turned to another page, dated 6 months later. Abigail says we're special, that what we share, the three of us, is sacred, that the world wouldn't understand. She's right about that last part, at least. How could anyone understand? How could I explain what happens in that bed, in that room, in the darkness? How could I tell anyone that sometimes I don't know where I end and Abigail begins? That Father's hands and Abigail's hands feel the same in the dark? That I've stopped fighting because fighting makes it worse, and surrender makes it end faster? Another page, another glimpse into hell. I tried to leave today, made it as far as the front door before Abigail stopped me. She didn't grab me or hurt me. She just looked at me with those sad eyes and said, "Where would you go, Eleanor? Who would take care of you? Who would love you like we do?" And she's right. I have no money, no skills, nowhere to go. No one wants me, only them. They want me. They need me. And isn't that a kind of love? Isn't that enough? The final entry was dated November 30th, just days before the screaming incident. Something is going to break. I can feel it building like a storm inside my chest. Abigail feels it too. I see her watching me with worry in her eyes. Father feels it too. He's been more possessive lately, more demanding. He says we're his angels. He says God gave us to him. He says we'll be together forever, even after death. I think he means it. I think he's planning something. I think... The entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if Eleanor had been interrupted, or stopped herself from writing something too terrible to put into words. Sound of pages turning, then stopping, heavy silence. Constable Thatcher closed the diary slowly, his hands trembling. He finally had his evidence. But what he had evidence of was so disturbing, so taboo, so far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior that he knew bringing charges would tear Salem apart. A father, his daughters, together. In ways that violated not just the law, but the fundamental order of human society. And worse, the suggestion that one daughter had become complicit. That Abigail wasn't just a victim, but a participant. Perhaps even a facilitator. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked quietly. Thatcher looked up at her, and for the first time in his career, he had no answer. Because he knew that whatever he did next would change everything. Not just for the Whittakers, for everyone. On December 15th, 1848, Constable William Thatcher made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would act. Armed with Eleanor's diary and the testimonies he'd gathered, he obtained a warrant from Judge Cornelius Hathaway. The language was carefully chosen, deliberately vague. Suspicion of unlawful confinement and mistreatment of dependents. They couldn't write what they really suspected. Some things were too dark to commit to official paper. Judge Hathaway had read portions of the diary. His hands had shaken as he signed the warrant. "God help those girls," he'd whispered, "and God help us all for not seeing it sooner." Thatcher assembled a small group, himself, Deputy James Crawford, and Dr. Werner, who would examine the sisters and document any evidence of physical harm. They would go at midday, when they had the full advantage of daylight and witnesses. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That morning, the sky over Salem turned the color of old bruises, purple-black clouds rolling in from the Atlantic, pregnant with snow and something that felt like rage. By 10 o'clock, the storm had arrived with a violence that shocked even the hardiest sailors. Wind screamed through the streets, tearing shutters from windows, ripping shingles from roofs. Snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to mere feet. The temperature plummeted. The world became white chaos. "We should wait!" Deputy Crawford shouted over the howling wind as they prepared to leave. "Go tomorrow when it clears." But Thatcher shook his head. He couldn't explain the feeling that had gripped him since dawn, a sense of urgency, of time running out, of something terrible approaching like the storm itself. "Today," he said. "It has to be today." They made their way through the blizzard, 3 men fighting against nature itself, until they reached Crooked Lane. The street was deserted, houses shuttered tight against the storm, and there, at the end of the lane, the Whittaker house stood dark and silent, as if waiting. Thatcher knocked, no answer. He knocked again, harder. "Augustus Whittaker, open this door by order of the law." Nothing. "We have a warrant," Crawford shouted. "Open up or we'll break it down." Still nothing. Thatcher nodded to Crawford, who put his shoulder to the door. The old wood held for 1 impact, 2, then splintered on the 3rd. The door swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. They entered, lanterns raised against the gloom. The house was silent, empty. But something was different from Thatcher's last visit. The air felt heavier, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. And that smell, that sweet, rotten smell, was stronger now, almost overwhelming. "Mr. Whittaker," Thatcher called. "Abigail! Eleanor! Show yourselves!" His voice echoed through the empty rooms and faded into silence. They searched the first floor. The parlor, the kitchen, a small study filled with Augustus's papers and tools. Nothing, no one. Then they climbed the stairs. The bedroom door was closed. No light showed beneath it. No sound came from within. Thatcher's hand hesitated on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this house, to forget what he'd seen and learned. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But he'd come too far. He opened the door. The room was lit by dozens of candles, covering every surface, burning with steady, unwavering flames despite the storm raging outside. The windows were still covered, still blocking any natural light. The air was thick with smoke, and that terrible sweet smell, and something else now, something chemical and wrong. In the center of the room, on that ornate 4-poster bed, lay 3 figures. Augustus Whittaker was in the middle, dressed in his best suit, hands folded across his chest. His eyes were closed. His face was peaceful. Dead. On his right side lay Eleanor, wearing a white nightgown, her auburn hair arranged carefully around her shoulders like a halo. Her eyes were closed. Her hands rested on her father's arm. Dead. On his left side lay Abigail, dressed identically to her sister, positioned as a mirror image. Her eyes were closed. Her hands touched her father's other arm. Dead. They looked like a grotesque family portrait, like some twisted parody of eternal rest. Dr. Werner moved forward immediately, checking each body for signs of life. But even from the doorway, Thatcher knew it was futile. The stillness was absolute. Final. "Poison," Dr. Werner said after a moment, his voice shaking. "Laudanum, most likely. A massive dose. They've been dead for hours." Crawford found the bottle on the nightstand, a large brown bottle, nearly empty, with no label. Beside it lay 3 cups, each with residue at the bottom. "Murder-suicide?" Crawford asked quietly. "Look around," Thatcher said, his voice hollow. "Tell me what you see." They looked, really looked. The room was arranged like a shrine. Personal items, hairbrushes, ribbons, small pieces of jewelry, were laid out in careful, symmetrical patterns on every surface. The walls were covered with drawings, dozens of them, crude sketches in charcoal showing 3 figures intertwined, inseparable, eternal. On the floor beside the bed lay 2 letters, sealed with wax. One was addressed to Constable Thatcher. The other was addressed, "To whom it may concern." Thatcher opened the letter addressed to him with trembling hands. The handwriting was Abigail's, precise, controlled, each letter perfectly formed. Dear Constable Thatcher, by the time you read this, we will be gone. Together, as we always were. As we always should be. I know what you think. I know what everyone thinks. That we were victims. That Father was a monster who corrupted us, who destroyed us. And perhaps in the beginning that was true. I was 14 when Mother died. Eleanor was 11. Father was lost in grief so profound it transformed him into something else, something hungry and desperate and wrong. He came to me first, in the darkness, seeking comfort that no father should seek from a daughter. I should have fought, I should have screamed, I should have run. But I didn't, because in his darkness, I found something I'd never had before. Power, control. His need made me necessary, his weakness made me strong. And when he began to reach for Eleanor too, I didn't protect her. I facilitated it. I held her hand through it. I whispered that it was love. I convinced her that we were special, chosen, bound together by something the world couldn't understand. And eventually, she believed me. She stopped fighting. She surrendered. And the three of us became something that shouldn't exist. A family bound not by love but by shared corruption, by mutual destruction, by the kind of intimacy that poisons everything it touches. You want to know who was the victim and who was the villain. But there is no clear answer. Father initiated it, yes. But I embraced it. I expanded it. I created the world we lived in, the prison we couldn't escape. Eleanor was the only true innocent, and I destroyed her just as surely as Father did. Perhaps more so because she trusted me. She loved me. And I used that love to trap her in hell. In recent months, Eleanor began to wake up, to see clearly what we were, what we'd become. The diary you found, yes, I know you found it. I'm the one who threw it from the window. I wanted someone to know. I wanted someone to stop us, but you came too late. 3 days ago, Eleanor tried to kill herself. She swallowed half a bottle of Father's laudanum while we slept. We saved her that time, forced her to vomit, walked her through the night until the poison passed. That was the screaming you heard, not Father hurting her. Eleanor furious at still being alive. She tried again the next day, and again. She wanted to die, needed to die, because she finally understood what we'd done to her. What I'd done to her. And I realized something in those terrible days. There was no escape for any of us. No redemption. No healing. We were too corrupted, too entangled, too broken to ever be whole again. Even if we left, even if we separated, we would carry this poison inside us forever. So I made a decision. I told Father what I planned. He didn't argue. I think in his twisted way, he was relieved. He was tired too. Tired of fighting his own nature. Tired of the monster he'd become. I told Eleanor last night, held her in my arms and explained that we would all go together, that we would end this terrible story the only way it could end. She cried, but she also nodded. She understood. This morning, we dressed in our best clothes. Father put on his suit. Eleanor and I wore the white nightgowns Mother had made for us years ago, when we were still innocent, still pure. We arranged the room, made it beautiful, made it meaningful, and then we drank. Father went first. Then Eleanor, then me. I'm writing this as we wait for the poison to take effect. Father is already sleeping. Eleanor is in my arms, getting drowsy. Soon I'll be drowsy too. We'll drift away together, and perhaps, in whatever comes next, we'll finally be free of what we did to each other in this life. Or perhaps there is no next. Perhaps we'll simply stop. And that would be mercy enough. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I don't ask for understanding. How could anyone understand? I only ask that you tell the truth about us, not the comfortable version where we were helpless victims of a tyrannical father. Tell the complicated truth, that we were all victims and all villains, that we destroyed each other in ways that can't be easily categorized or condemned. Tell them that evil isn't always simple, that corruption isn't always forced, that sometimes people choose the darkness because the light is too painful to bear. Tell them we died together because we couldn't imagine living apart. And tell them that in our own terrible way we loved each other, even if that love was the most destructive thing we ever possessed. Abigail Whittaker, December 15th, 1848. 3:47 a.m. The second letter contained Augustus's will and a confession of his own, briefer, less articulate, but no less damning. He left everything to my beloved daughters, who showed me kindness when the world showed me none. He detailed the beginning of the abuse, framing it as mutual comfort that had evolved into something deeper. He never used the word wrong. He never expressed remorse. To the very end, Augustus Whittaker believed he loved his daughters, and perhaps in his twisted way he did. The authorities worked quickly to suppress the details. The official story was that Augustus Whittaker and his daughters had died of accidental poisoning, a tragic mistake involving laudanum taken for medical purposes. Eleanor's diary was seized and destroyed. Abigail's letter was locked away in Judge Hathaway's private files, never to be made public. The few people who knew the truth were sworn to silence. The house on Crooked Lane was sold at auction 6 months later. The new owners lasted less than a year before moving away, claiming the place had an oppressive atmosphere they couldn't tolerate. Over the following decades, the house changed hands repeatedly. Each owner reported the same things: strange sounds at night, the smell of flowers and rot, shadows that moved independently of any light source. By 1875, the house stood empty. By 1900, it had fallen into ruin. By 1925, it had been torn down completely, the land left vacant. But the story didn't die. In Salem, some stories never die. They just change form, become legend, become warning. People still talked about the Whittaker sisters in hushed voices, the two young women who lived with their father in unnatural intimacy, who died together in that dark bedroom, who loved each other in ways that destroyed them all. They called it a tragedy. They called it a scandal. They called it an abomination. They were right on all counts. William Thatcher never spoke publicly about what he found in that bedroom, but those who knew him noticed the change. He aged rapidly after that December day. His hair turned gray within a year. He developed a tremor in his hands that never went away. He stopped attending social functions, stopped going to church, stopped participating in the community life he'd once embraced. At night, neighbors reported they could see a single lamp burning in his study until dawn. He was writing, they said, filling journal after journal with his thoughts about the Whittaker case. Those journals were found after his death in 1863 and promptly burned by his widow, who claimed they contained unhealthy obsessions and dark philosophies. But a single page survived, tucked into a Bible he'd left to his son. On it, in Thatcher's increasingly shaky handwriting, was a single paragraph. People want evil to be simple. They want monsters to be recognizable, victims to be blameless, justice to be clear. But the Whittaker case taught me that real evil is complicated. It's victims who become villains. It's love that becomes poison. It's families that destroy from within. And the most terrifying truth of all, sometimes the only escape from corruption, is annihilation. Sometimes people are too broken to save. Sometimes the kindest thing fate can offer is an ending. So what really happened in that house on Crooked Lane? We'll never know the complete truth. We can't interview the dead. We can't see into those dark rooms where 3 people enacted their mutual destruction night after night, year after year. But we can piece together the fragments. A father, broken by grief, who sought comfort in the worst possible place. A daughter, Abigail, who learned to weaponize her father's weakness, who transformed from victim to enabler to perpetrator. Another daughter, Eleanor, caught between them, trapped by love and fear, and learned helplessness, who finally woke up to the horror of her existence and chose death over continued imprisonment. We can understand, perhaps, that trauma doesn't always create sympathy. Sometimes it creates new trauma. Sometimes victims become abusers. Sometimes love becomes indistinguishable from torture. The Whittaker sisters weren't just victims. They weren't just villains. They were human beings caught in a cycle of abuse so complete, so consuming, that it erased the boundaries between perpetrator and prey. And in the end, they chose to die together because they couldn't imagine any other ending to their terrible story. In 1848, in Salem, Massachusetts, 3 people died in a bedroom filled with candles and shadows. They died holding hands. They died believing they loved each other. And perhaps that's the most disturbing truth of all, that love and destruction are not opposites, that sometimes they are the same thing. The Whittaker sisters loved their father loved them, and that love killed them all. Final note. The names and specific details in this story have been preserved from historical records, though many documents were destroyed or sealed. The house on Crooked Lane no longer exists. The Whittaker family plot in the Salem cemetery contains 3 graves, side by side, with simple headstones that bear only names and dates. No flowers are ever left there. But sometimes in winter, when snow falls heavy and the world grows quiet, people walking past that section of the cemetery report, feeling a profound sadness, as if the ground itself remembers what happened in that dark bedroom over 170 years ago. Some stories demand to be told. Some truths refuse to stay buried. And some families are bound together by chains that not even death can break. The end. We loved each other, even if that love was the most destructive thing we ever possessed. Abigail Whittaker, 1848.